Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Naturalist Capitalist. I am your host, Reed Coverdale, as always, and I've got a familiar face, Horatio, back on the show again. How's it going, Horatio?
Man, it's going well. Just trying to navigate these interesting political headwinds we got going on.
Yeah, aren't we all? So, I've had you on two other times. The first time was back in July or so, and the consensus that you had back then was that Joe Biden sucked, but Trump was so terrible, we have to get rid of him. Joe Biden was kind of the only alternative. And then we talked again a couple months later, and you had done more research on Biden, and you could not bring yourself to support him either.
Right.
And you weren't really sure what you were going to do. So why don't you tell us what you did end up doing, why you chose to do that, and just any reflections on that process.
Right. So, as I've discussed before, I'm a lifelong Democrat. One of my saddest moments, in political viewing was, 2000, watching, Al Gore losing, the presidential, race, and, sitting in his home in Tennessee, and he had just lost Tennessee. And I felt bad for Al Gore in that moment, right? And so, generally I have voted for Democratic candidates. And, that was going to be, the case with, Joe Biden as well. But, one thing that I can generally say about Democrats, although I don't, typically go, left, I'm somewhat of a conservative. Democrats put forward normally the smarter candidates. And I don't, give a lot of credence to the Ivy League, but, they're normally Ivy League educated. They've had, experience with legislators, and, very well spoken, great communicators, a little high-minded, but detached. As I did my review of Joe Biden, it just became increasingly apparent that he did not have the intellectual, capacity, to lead this nation at this time. Different time span, perhaps he could have been a good figurehead, a good statesman when, the U.S., economically was better positioned in terms of imports and export dominance. And also we're militarily, we were, still far and away, without rival. And, we didn't have as many, technical, assaults on our democracy and technical assaults on, our way of life from a capitalist standpoint. I don't think Joe Biden has, the aptitude, to, handle all those issues and make the best decision, irrespective of what experts he has. He's also doesn't have the intelligence to discern, where those experts are going to go with their decisions, right? You can have, the most, intelligent people, but they can lead you down a terrible path, as, Henry Kissinger, once showed. So looking at the duopoly, looking at, how, they brought us these two, mediocre talents at the top of the tickets, I really and truly determined that it's a byproduct, of the establishment, irrespective of how I felt about Trump. And I thought Trump was actually a swipe at establishment politics. I felt like Biden was just a regression back, towards, a do as you say, not as you choose to do type of candidate that's going to sway towards, corporate interest. And so against all, prior indications, throughout my life, I actually moved forward with voting for Joe. So I voted for Joe Jorgensen and not Joe Biden. And specifically because of the fact that we had good talks and, you do the research and you realize that, a lot of things that are key in interest to me, whether it be, taking down not just the elite politicians, but just the entrenched elite throughout our nation, right? And leading to a democratization of power, of decisions, and, not having these corporate overlords. As you've, spoken on a lot, government helps to fuel that. When the government spends, a dollar, 89, cents of that dollar, or whatever the case is going to be, is going to go towards, those few. And so by limiting government action, you're actually going to limit, the power of the elites. And I think that it's just time to, pause and ask, irrespective of what program is being launched, who benefited from it? And it invariably always comes back, to that same few who benefit, whether it's PPP loans, which were specifically for small businesses, right? That few still benefited from these PPP loans. So it's just a failed experiment. And we have to move forward with a process of limiting government spending and limiting government actions so that we, the people, can have a more robust life.
Yeah, so the way the election ended up going is unfortunate, in my opinion. Not so much who was a victor, but I was hoping for a surge in third-party votes, and we did
Right.
not see that. Kanye West won more votes than the Green Party, which was,
Right.
pretty sad. The conclusion I came away with it is that my position is still unchanged. Even though the Libertarian Party didn't do even close to how well I was hoping,
Right.
Donald Trump is already talking about running for president again in 4 years, and something like 80% of Republicans are all in on that.
Right.
I believe Kamala Harris is going to be the de facto nominee in 2024. There are people talking about primarying her. That's a joke, in my opinion. So, I wish there had been a blowout, and there wasn't, but I still have nowhere to go because the two parties are so they're just so sunk in corruption and bureaucracy, and there's no way out. So, what is your thought going forward? Do you kind of share that view? Do we have to pave a new way?
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at the third parties, like let's be forward, when we look at the Libertarian Party and we look at Jo Jorgensen, I don't think that anyone was deluded into believing that she was going to win, and I also don't believe there was a delusion that she was the best candidate possible for this time, in the sense that a candidate that had visibility, that was going to do serious damage in multiple states, to these two candidates. I think that amongst the alternatives, Jo Jorgensen she was the most intelligent, and I felt that she had a process that was going to do the best to help power be diluted back to or be delivered back to the people, right? By tackling government corruption, tackling waste, tackling needless wars. But again, she just wasn't a transcendent candidate. She had never won an elected office. And so I think that, there's a bit of reality there that if we look at, what this election symbolized, when there were two, historically bad candidates at the top of the Republican and Democratic tickets, Jo wasn't necessarily best positioned, to capitalize on that. And when you look at the Green Party, they had their own internal feuds, right? Like, from everything I've researched, Howie Hawkins, who was the Green Party candidate, is a trust fund baby, and he actually bought his way to the top of this ticket. So even on your tertiary parties, where they're supposed to be explicit advocates, right, for certain interests, their candidate was someone who was able to be propped up by his wealth as opposed to his fierce advocacy. And I think that that's one of the key considerations, whether you're looking at Libertarian Party, Green Party, the Constitutional Party, the other the American Solidarity Party. I think that those are some of the top third party options. You have to have someone who is explicitly throughout their lifetime or throughout their recent lifetime voted to and successful at advocating for the interests of that party, and it cannot be anything where it's overly a corrupting influence either, because of course with the Libertarian Party, as we discussed on Twitter and as we saw a lot of, there were a lot of purity tests in terms of what is a real libertarian, and who's not a real libertarian. For the representation you have within this population, you can't have those sorts of arguments. You have to kind of expand that umbrella as much as possible without completely crumbling, your tent. So I think that that's one thing that libertarians need to learn moving forward, is that, there are different, there's different people on the different ends of the spectrum of libertarianism. But I think that, whether you're on that, libertarian progressive end or you're on the libertarian anarchist end, you have to come together to realize, hey, look, your voice right now means nothing. You have no voice whatsoever on a national level. And so I think moving forward, that should be a call to arms for the Libertarian Party. Green Party has to be more pure in terms of their candidates and their advocacy. And the other third party, they stand for something substantial, and they need additional resources, or they just need more captivating, transcendent candidates to put at the top of their platforms and to win statewide elections or to win municipal elections before trying to prop someone up, to go before the nation and say, I can lead this nation. It's a long shot.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. And the last time we talked, you were saying that Rand Paul should join the Libertarian Party, Tulsi Gabbard should join the Libertarian Party, AOC should join the Green Party. I think you're 100% spot on with that thought. And I like what you just said about the different layers of libertarianism. You know, there you have people who are more right leaning and more left leaning. What they have to realize is that the Democrats and Republicans don't represent them at all.
No.
So if we can solidify behind a core principle of liberty and we can discuss what that means in different levels, that's what we have to do. What was really disappointing to me about this election, more than the presidential election, was how many incumbents won their seats back in Congress. There were very few incumbents who were unseated. I was obviously hoping for libertarians to win somewhere. They didn't. But if that didn't happen, I was at least hoping for a switch, you know, for them to vote in somebody else to get rid of their incumbents. And they mostly didn't. They're happy with the way the system is going, apparently. And that's kind of mind-boggling to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that when the switches happen, and some instances, it happens, towards approaching lunacy, right? I remember Eric Cantor, who was either, I apologize, he was either House majority, I believe he was House Majority Leader in the early 2010s. He lost his seat to a more conservative candidate, and Eric Cantor was pretty freaking conservative, right? And so the demagoguery and just the foolishness that candidates have to speak in order to pivot and flank these incumbents leads towards a point where we can't have practical conversations, right? You look at Jack Kemp in Georgia, who obviously was not in the race, but just to speak to his politics, he said that he had a truck so that he could round up illegal immigrants in his previous race. Now, because Georgia has been certified for Joe Biden, this guy is saying, or Donald Trump is saying, hey, this guy is not a real Republican. He's not a real conservative. And I'm like, so what level of fringe, do you want to see, from, incumbents in order for them to be, considered, committed to the party, right? Like how committed do they need to be to, to your personal, politics, to your personal political ambitions? And if that's the case, who beats that person, right? Someone who outflanks them, to either an extreme, left or an extreme right. And that's what you've seen with a lot of people who were actually unseated. The candidate in Virginia, the Republican candidate who was unseated in his primary because he had officiated a gay wedding. You had Cori Bush, who's a liberal advocate, and she outflanked a long-term representative. I just think that when you look across the board, your politics have to be radical in order for you to unseat an incumbent, and that shouldn't be the case. And one other point that I want to bring up, one other person who was able to be unseated was a long-term Democratic representative in Brooklyn who was unseated by Jamal Brown. I'm not an advocate for Jamal Brown. I'm not really an advocate for the Justice Democrats, but I like seeing that transfer of power from long-term incumbents. And I think that the American people just have to be smarter voters, and we don't need to implement laws for term limits. We don't need to push for reform in terms of like elections. We just need to consciously be able to determine the fact that someone's been in office for too long. DC is a corrupting influence on anyone who goes there. And the longer you're in DC, the least likely you are to reflect our interests, at home as your constituents. And it's time for us to pick another candidate, irrespective of their political leanings. If you're a Democrat and you want to vote, for a new Democrat, I prefer that over, just voting in the exact same person continuously year after year.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept that we don't need term limits. I actually heard an interview with Spike Cohen. I think he was talking with Larry Sharp, and he kind of mirrored what you just said there. He said that accepting that we need term limits is basically accepting that Americans cannot govern themselves.
Right.
And it's true. I mean, I think that there is a lot of media manipulation out there, and there's a lot of even quote unquote fake news. But when it comes down to it, I think Americans are going to believe what they want to believe, even if the facts are all laid out right in front of them without any bias. And that's something we need to move beyond. We need to become a critically thinking society. I don't know if again is the right term. Maybe we never were, but it does seem like things are getting worse. As far as you said earlier, you didn't think Biden would be able to pick good advisors, basically. So I want to talk about the people he is choosing. The Democrats did not talk much about war and imperialism, and those are things that I care about a lot. But during the debates, it was barely brought up. You know, the candidate I was supporting didn't even get much attention because it was such a minor issue. But one thing that was extremely central was immigration. I mean, that was talked about so much throughout the campaign. And Biden, for his transition team, I just want to make sure I get her name here right. He chose Cecilia Munoz, who was a big advocate of the child separation policy at the border. She basically shielded any criticism about Barack Obama during his presidency when he was basically reporter in chief. And then Alejandro, I'm going to forget his last name. It's Mayorkas, I think. Alejandro Mayorkas, who's going to be able to drastically affect change in immigration policy. He hasn't even committed to getting rid of that policy. He has spoken sort of negatively about it, but all this hype during the campaign, and Biden and his transition team can't even commit to ending that policy. I just find that hilarious. And then you look at other areas like climate change, you know, he's choosing John Kerry and other people who have, you know, basically been bought out by the fossil fuel industry to head his climate change, you know, to head the EPA and to head his climate organization. And it's just hilarious to me that the Democrats have just been completely duped into voting for him, because the issues that they claim they care about the most, there's going to be minimal change, if any. And most of the changes are going to be virtue signaling, because, you know, it'll be like, oh, we have a black woman, or we have a gay woman, or we, you know, that seems to be what is the most important right now. What gender or what color or what sexuality the people he is appointing are, not what their policies are actually going to be.
Right. I agree wholeheartedly. And one thing, you know, being a black man, obviously, you know, one thing I hear a lot is representation matters, right? Representation matters, which I disagree with wholeheartedly. And I shouldn't say that representation does not matter, right? I think that, you know, in certain forums and, you know, in certain doses, representation, you know, in and of itself is sufficient, right? The fact that you have, you know, a black man or a black woman in a certain position, it can communicate progress, it can communicate openness, diversity, whatever, you know, virtue you want to, you know, communicate. When it comes to politics, and, you know, as I, you know, discussed with, you know, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, it is the same for, you know, any respective race, you know, gender, religion, whatever the case may be. Advocacy is the ultimate determinant of whether or not someone should be in a position. And if it is a blue person who is willing to advocate and is intelligent enough and, you know, knowledgeable enough about laws, you know, historical constraints that affect yellow people, so be it. Vote for the blue person. Right? If it's a green monster who's advocating for, you know, the Lilliputians, whatever the case may be, but that green monster, you know, has, you know, a PhD in Lilliputian studies and has been, you know, gone to jail and, you know, stood on the front lines protesting for the Lilliputians, whatever the case may be, I would give that green monster consideration. And I think that that's one of the key things that has really turned me, you know, sideways about the Democratic Party. And just to speak on it very shortly, Bernie Sanders was a civil rights activist. He took time out of his day, and when he was in his young 20s, to stand on front lines and march for the civil rights movement. I'm not a Bernie Sanders, you know, supporter. I respect that about Bernie Sanders. In 2016, you had John Lewis, who is a congressman and a civil rights, you know, legend, speak against Bernie Sanders in support of Hillary Clinton and say, I never saw Bernie Sanders on those lines. but Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton have been advocates for black people for a long time. And you have to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl. You know what I mean? She was, mired in her own wealth and her own politics. She wasn't actually advocating. She wasn't fighting. Bill and Hillary pushed for, the 94 crime bill, and not because of the fact that it was, some sort of, relief on, minority communities and poor communities. It was because they viewed it as politically palatable to swing voters in the midterm elections of 1994. And who stamped that? Well, the Congressional Black Caucus lended their political weight to this in order for it to go through. So you look forward and you say, well, the Congressional Black Caucus was able to sell out, black people, with a law that they openly debated at that time was going to be problematic and disproportionately affect black people in order to give Bill Clinton a bone. And it failed, right? Like they still lost the 94 midterm elections in a historic fashion. But those black people still have to live with the consequences. And this same man 20 years later, denigrates someone who actually stood on the front lines, fighting and sat and risking himself the same way that you risk yourself. That's why, and so that's where it comes back to who's the advocates, right? And are they currently advocating, right? John Lewis or whomever else was a civil rights leader, whichever feminist, archetype was, whether it be Ruth Bader Ginsburg or whomever, they fought 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or, you were intellectually pure, 20 and 30 years ago, but haven't been in Congress, for a period of time. Are you still advocating, right? Are you still fighting, for your constituents or for the group that you profess to fight for? And that has more times than not proven not to be the case, right? They're going with the power. They're going towards the establishment. They're going towards, where they can build their own wealth.
Yeah, this whole idea that that we care more about the color of someone's skin or their gender than their policies, you've kind of gone full circle at that point. Right. You have been defeated by yourself because you're no longer caring about what happens to whatever group of people that you want to name. You just care that color of the skin of the person who's in power is that color. And I don't see how that's distinguishable from racism anymore, or sexism, or whatever. I want to talk about Brexit. Go ahead.
Right, Ben Carson doesn't get. I was gonna say Ben Carson doesn't get that love. Katrina Pearson, who's a Trump surrogate, doesn't get that love. Any number of black Republicans don't get that love. We know that these individuals are not necessarily advocating, right? And I say not necessarily because they might view their politics through the prism of black identity in some regard. But the Democrats and liberal leaning politicians get this passed, and it's like, whoa. You have to still go through the check also for these guys and figure out, hey, look, are they really advocating for you? How do you benefit by this person being in this position at this time?
Yeah. I want to talk about Bernie Sanders because you brought him up there. Joe Biden has said that he's going to put Neera Tanden in charge of the Office of Management and Budget, which to progressives, that is a pretty important position. And Neera Tanden has just gone after Bernie Sanders for his entire career. She's tried to defame him, tried to delegitimize him at every turn. He hasn't said anything about this yet. The only person who's attacked this has actually been Tulsi Gabbard because Neera Tanden has horrible views on foreign policy. She's detestable. But I have to wonder at this point if Bernie Sanders is literally controlled opposition. And I know you and I have talked about this in chats or whatever, but he has been a very valuable tool to subjugate the progressive left into supporting the establishment. And I don't see what effective change he has made other than that, because the way to really kill a movement is to co-opt it. Because if you're always opposing it, it's hard to kill it. But if you can place it under your banner, then you have destroyed it. And in my mind, that's what Bernie Sanders has done. So do you think he got paid off or something? Or what are your thoughts on him? Do you think he's a fake? That's kind of where I arrived at.
One thing, I'm openly, not a Bernie Sanders fan. I will never malign Bernie Sanders' heart or his authenticity, in his advocacy. I believe that he truly believes, that poor people, are marginalized by American politics, and I think that he truly, wants to see change. I believe that Bernie is just ill-equipped to do so. So, I think that, there's a difference between, a willingness, like, and having a passion to do something and having the capacity to do it. And I think that for Bernie, his passion was always there. And I think that you look at, his advocacy and his views, they've been fairly consistent throughout his lifetime. It's well documented, where he's, stood on various issues. I think that, where he loses a lot of people is the fact that Bernie is old, one. Bernie has been in D.C. for a long time. Bernie has been, I think he's been a congressman or a senator since, 91. And the same corrupting influences that, affect everyone else, affect Bernie Sanders. And then three, Bernie doesn't make a lot of friends. So I don't know if he would be controlled opposition, because it's openly communicated the fact that Bernie has a very surly personality. He's self-righteous, to a certain degree, and I think that he's assured in his own, correctness, right? So he believes to a fault that he is right, and I don't think that he listens to counsel very well. I don't think that he partners well with other people. So a lot of his, work, it is, to his betterment or his detriment, a reflection of his thoughts and his opinions at any given point in time. And I think just because of how his personality is structured and his temperament, it precludes him from being as effective as he needs to be. Because you have to be able to compromise, irrespective of your values. Again, whether it's libertarian, whether you're Green Party, whether you're an anarchist, if you want to be effective in a country that's essentially in the center, you have to show some compromise. I think Bernie's hard to compromise on anything, aside from one key fact: he refused to attack Joe Biden, which, for the life of me to this day, I don't understand why Bernie, who is a very intelligent person, refused, against advice, to attack Joe Biden, specifically because of the fact that he liked Joe and Jill Biden. That just shows he didn't have the temperament and the willingness to really go for the jugular and close this thing out. Because if he had that, I think he could have possibly won, and kudos to him, but he didn't have it.
Yeah, I agree. And that was actually aggravating to me when I was a Tulsi supporter, that she didn't go after Joe Biden. It was actually hilarious, one of these latest tweets she made, asking Joe Biden, "Are you sure you want Neera Tanden? Is this really who you want?" I'm thinking, right. Tulsi, of course that's who he wants. Like, this is right. Joe Biden we're talking about. And for some reason, you did not touch that sacred cow, even though all the things you were lambasting Hillary for, he also supported. He might have been a little bit less hawkish on the war in Libya, but he voted for the war in Iraq that you served in. It was just mind-boggling. Like, a lot of people, the only guy that I saw really go after Joe Biden was, what was his name there? The Hispanic guy in the Julian Castro. Yeah, he's the only guy.
He's the only, and you know what? I never give political contributions, right? Because if you want to run an effective campaign, do that on someone else's dime. Julian Castro is the only candidate, from this past political cycle that I actually donated money to. I gave him the minimum $3, just because of the fact that I could tell he actually wanted it. He actually felt that his presence on that stage made a difference. And I don't do identity politics, but I felt like his voice as the Hispanic Tejano representative was upended and undermined by Beto. So Beto is took the Hispanic vote by storm in Texas, right? And his name, he's not Hispanic. It's Robert. His name is really
Robert Francis.
Robert, Francis. He's Irish. But by going by the Spanish nickname, it endeared him to a lot of Hispanic voters in Texas, and I think Castro legitimately resented that. because he felt like, yeah, he's, speaking, on behalf of you. He speaks Spanish, but aside from all that, I'm legitimate, right? Like I'm actually going to, advocate, for our people. And so I voted for Julian just because of the fact that I felt that, he was kind of, done dirty in that regard. But yeah, he attacked Biden, but everyone else just kind of laid flat. Elizabeth Warren did, but she did it just kind of as an aside. She swiped at all other candidates. And it just comes back to the fact that, the people who are in power, if you had asked me 2 years ago who was going to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, I would have told you Joe Biden. Yeah. Once Kamala Harris, announced, I was fairly certain she'd be the vice presidential candidate. I hoped against all hopes that it wouldn't be the case. And I voted in the Democratic primary for Elizabeth Warren. But the establishment won out. And Neera Tanden, going back to your point about her, she's the establishment. She's a close confidant, not just through the Obama administration. She's a close Bill and Hillary Clinton. So she's, again, the establishment personified, the same old guys getting the same old roles and having the same old influence with their same bad policies, just in a different position. And I agree with progressives on calling that sort of thing out, because it's not correcting any of the grave issues that are corrupting our government. And her Libya, and I think you're talking about the Libya tweet. I saw your response to that. Absolutely insane that she said that they should pay us in oil. We shouldn't be there to begin with. And we've destabilized an entire country for our self-sanctimonious thoughts on what democracy is. And I think that when we look forward for other candidates, that twin devil of, foreign and domestic considerations has to be at the forefront. And who are they going to put in key positions for foreign considerations and domestic considerations? And I don't think that the American people give that enough thought, because at this point, I'm just not sure if the American people have the competence to do so.
Yeah, I completely agree. They don't give that any thought. I've been on other people's shows, and they're talking about how they can't believe that the Americans thought Biden would be better on foreign policy. And I tell them, Americans don't think about foreign policy. They're not, when they're at the ballot box, they're not thinking about Libya or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan. That's off the radar for them. For me, obviously, that has been a huge issue. And there was actually one point in time this year where I thought I might vote for anybody but Trump. And that was after he airstriked General Soleimani, because that just showed complete instability and recklessness that I wasn't even sure Joe Biden would execute. I don't think Joe Biden would be that irrational, even though he's a massive hawk. But he is choosing Antony Blinken as his Secretary of State. Antony Blinken thinks that Russia is an adversary that we need to be harder on. He thinks we're not hard enough on Iran, that we need more sanctions. He kind of parrots all the terrible talking points that Mike Pompeo believes in. He has said that we're not going to hold Israel accountable. That's paraphrasing, but he's basically said we will support Israel no matter what they do. So on my show, I attack Trump more than Biden, because I think most of the people who follow me are not Biden supporters. I mean, the people who watch The Naturalist Capitalist, they're mostly like disaffected Republicans or progressives, independents, libertarians. So my whole point to them is that losing Trump and Trump's cabinet is not any tragedy. But I do want to make it abundantly clear that Joe Biden's cabinet, as far as foreign policy, constitutional rights, any of those things goes, it is, I think, a slight downgrade from Trump's, if not just equal to it. What do you think just overall about the choices he's making? To me it's like almost like he's testing his voters to see how far he can push it and get away with it, with just being the most corporate centrist Wall Street elitist hack he can be, before someone will finally say, okay, why did I vote for you? I'm not understanding this.
Right. I think that, I think I'd reached out about, one specific appointment, Janet Yellen, former, chair of the Federal Reserve. And the thing that's disconcerting to me, you don't want, ideally, right, if you're not holistically, advocating for, the abolishment of the Federal Reserve, you at least want, Treasury and Fed to be, adversaries to a degree, right? You want them to be
Yeah.
separate in their thoughts, to be separate in their interests, so that above everything else, the will of the American people and corporate interests are divided, right? And so I think that when you bring in someone who is a former, Fed chair, that's significantly worse to me than all of these former Goldman Sachs executives that you bring in, because now you're not just looking at the interests of just one sector of corporate America. You're looking at the interests of all of corporate America, which the Federal Reserve has advocated for tremendously. And I think that one of the things that I would like to see from Janet Yellen, which I doubt she will say, I would want to see anyone who came into the treasury position criticize the trillions of dollars that the Fed has gone out and lended to corporate America during this pandemic, with no strings attached and no oversight. I would need a Treasury Secretary who understood just how much that benefited the corporates, and how much it hurt Main Street, and how much it helps to drive wealth divide between the have and the have-nots, how much it helps to empower entrenched companies, some that were not performing well, and if had left to their own devices and there were no pandemic, a lot of them would have been filing for bankruptcy irrespective of in 2020, right? And so this Fed lending facility has actually helped zombie companies be extended out and given an additional lifeline, because they have endless credit. And so if you have an endless amount of credit, I can endlessly just borrow money and continue to refinance those loans and go on, irrespective of the fact that I am no longer a viable organization. There's no genuine market for the products or services I'm producing. I need a Treasury Secretary who can have an honest conversation like that with the American people. Janet Yellen's not going to do that, right? She's going to help to continue to masquerade, this bubble of activity and abundance. And really and truly, we need for, the government to have a retrenchment in terms of its activity in the market, and to allow some of these bad companies with these wasteful executives who have overly leveraged their companies to fail. And we're refusing to let them fail, but no one's talking about it this time. Whereas in 2008, it was an open dialogue about too big to fail. We at least had a public discourse about it. In 2020, too big to fail became a lot smaller in terms of its functionality, if you look at it. And there was no public discourse. It was all done behind the veil with the Federal Reserve. So to me, Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary is the most concerning pick of Joe Biden's administration thus far.
Yeah, I agree. And when Trump won in 2016, I was a little bit hopeful, because he did talk about how we were living in a bubble and how the Federal Reserve had manufactured this fake economy. And Janet Yellen was the head of the Federal Reserve at that time. But she is a huge believer in low interest rates, which has been the number one cause of the decline of the middle class in this country. And I don't know if she's the one who broke Trump or if he was just always fake, but when he appointed Jerome Powell, we ended up with more of the same. Jerome Powell has been incredibly friendly toward low interest rates. Like, there was this talk that the Fed was going to hike interest rates to try to bring the economy back to normal, and they never did it. They ended up going back on it, and they've dropped the rates even lower now.
Right.
The last thing I wanted to talk about was how the election turned out and what the response has been to it. So, as I've said on this show and in tweets, I have no doubt there was fraud and there was systemic rigging, in the sense that there was gerrymandering on both sides. The Republicans made it harder for Democrats to vote in certain areas. The Democrats made it harder for Republicans. But I don't believe in these conspiracies that the election was literally stolen from Donald Trump. I think that's a very magnificent claim that requires a lot of evidence to back it up. Right. But what we've seen is almost the reciprocation of Russiagate. So for those who are watching who don't know what Russiagate was, it was basically the idea that Russia helped rig the election for Trump. The Republicans, Rudy Giuliani and others in the cabinet, and then just straight up voters, are claiming that Venezuela wanted Joe Biden to win, and that their voting machinery was rigged to favor Joe Biden. And then there have even been conspiracies that North Korea brought boatloads of ballots in to rig the election for Joe Biden. And when Russiagate was raging a few years ago, I thought it was ridiculous. I was just like, guys, just admit that you had a horrible candidate that somehow
Right.
lost to Donald Trump,
Right.
regroup and move forward. And now the Republicans are doing exactly the same thing. And I'm saying, guys, look, you had a guy who failed on most of his promises. He has not been a good president. He's been a worldwide disaster in 2020. Just admit that he wasn't what he said he was going to be and try to regroup and figure out how maybe you can win my vote next time. But now they're just doing the same thing the Democrats did, and people who I actually had high regard for are buying into this. People who were skeptical of Russiagate and calling it what it was, they're buying this hook, line, and sinker. It's just a fascinating phenomenon to me. I just want to hear your thoughts on it.
I think that you're right. I think that it shouldn't play out this way, but the Democratic Party's response to losing the 2016 elections helped lead up to the Republican response to losing the 2020 election. Russia had minimal impact on the outcome of that election, right? Like, from all evidence, from all the hearings you Democrats participated in, there is little evidence that Russia affected the way that American people actually voted. Did the Trump campaign make overtures to Russian government officials and attempt to coordinate some activity? Absolutely, it happened. But it had no impact, right? And this was also something that was openly discussed in 2016. So at the time that the elections were taking place, the American people knew that the Trump government, and they knew it because Trump openly, said as much, right? Hey, look, Russia, if you have, any evidence on Hillary Clinton, bring it my way. He says this in a nationally broadcast press conference. So the American people knew that if, the Russian government has something, you had a presidential candidate who was willing to work with them, to uncover this information. The American people knew that Donald Trump had, wild tendencies, and he was voted in, but not by a majority, but by an electoral majority, because of the fact that Hillary Clinton personified the establishment, and the establishment, kneeling to certain personalities more so than any candidate I can think of in my lifetime, right? I mean, she ran against three minor names in the Democratic Party. There was no, determined opposition. And I don't include Bernie Sanders because if he doesn't want to include himself as a Democrat, I'm not going to call him a Democrat. But if not, running against Hillary Clinton, I'm not sure if Bernie Sanders was even a thing, right? He was just the only viable opposition to her at that time. But the Democrats lost with a bad candidate who, for whatever reason, stored state secrets on a personal server, which I still think is criminal, in my personal point. And then you look back at 2020, and Republicans are saying, you know what, they helped to delegitimize our candidate for 4 years. We had to, host all these hearings. We had to, go through all these motions, to appease, that section of the American people who thought that this might have been rigged. We're going to do the same thing. Damn what the external considerations are. Damn what the rest of the world thinks. We're going to openly criticize our democracy, and put it on a global stage. That's following the Democrats' lead. Okay, that's the Democrats, yielding power to Russia, which is not an influence globally, right? Which is not this dramatic power. You made Russia more relevant by extending this out. And I'm sure that North Korea and Venezuela, they'll take whatever publicity they can take also, and take it to the bank, because again, these are not affluent countries. Venezuela has gone through massive inflation, all sorts of economic issues and political upheaval. North Korea is truly it's a hermit state. They don't have the technological capacities to interfere with our elections. They can run their own, country in a viable way. So by giving credence to these countries, we're giving them a presence, to act as, troublesome actors moving forward more than we need to, and helping them to feel that they've been able to, govern and decide, the outcome of the election of what should be, the freest and fairest elections on the face of the planet. That's troubling, irrespective of who's doing it, Democratic or Republican.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that it's unfortunate that we have a press that is equally as untrustworthy as Trump. I think Trump, the people who believe everything Trump says are drinking some serious Kool-Aid. But if you believe everything the mainstream media says without investigating it, or at least reading the articles, they do a lot of misleading headlines and everything, then you're also not dealing with reality. The saddest thing to me about Trump losing is that at least with Trump, we had there was an opposition between the mainstream media and the administration, and now that's kind of gone. We're going to have, Fox News might reignite as an extreme right-wing news organization, but they're kind of fringe. Most of the mainstream media is going to back up Joe Biden. So I think we're really entering an age where people like you and me have to do all we can just to get the word out there about what's really going on. And that's kind of sad.
Yeah, I mean, I look on my Facebook, even my Republican friends, right, on Facebook, you're seeing people discussing Christmas shopping, and they're going about their lives, right, discussing the holidays. When I'm on Twitter, if I'm forward, there was a lot of energy and there was a lot of excitement, leading up to this election, and from a lot of the libertarians and progressives on Twitter. And even in their criticisms now, it seems diluted, right? It seems like it's been blunted a little bit, and it's not as fiery, it's not as involved. And so I think that continued pressure, that continued sense of unease with the way things are, it's important. But for a wide swath of the American people, I think they've kind of shrugged their shoulders after this election and just said, okay, well, back to normal, and they've proceeded with their lives, completely unchanged by this massive, and when I say massive, massive, political misdeed that put Joe Biden into the presidency. Someone who, for obvious reasons, showed himself intellectually and temperamentally incapable of being president when he was a much younger man, is now suddenly, a qualified statesman as he's, mentally declining. That's troublesome, right? So, yeah, we're gonna continue. I'm gonna continue to fight. I'm gonna continue to speak it as it is. I'm not going to, bow down to pressures from, Republican or Democratic interests. But I think when I look at, the audience for that sort of content, when I look at, people's, sentiments right now, it seems like a lot of people are just either deflated or, just they're generally disinterested, even on the opposition.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, I want to thank you for coming on again. We'll have you back for sure because I think our conversations have a bit of chemistry to them. It's good. And I'll put a link in the description to Horatio's Twitter account so you guys can go follow him. Go follow him on Twitter. And as I said, we'll have you back, Horatio. Thanks for coming again.
Hey, I appreciate it, Reed.